According to the right-wing press, the UK has a worklessness crisis, with the new Prime Minister being told to get a grip of work-shy Britain. It's always ordinary people that are to blame, never the politicians, never big business. Work-shy, lazy and disinclined to work. If it's true that the UK is work-shy, that sounds pretty bad. The evidence that these news stories is based on is shown in the following graph. Economic inactivity is defined as people who are not in employment and who are not seeking employment. It doesn't include the unemployed who are claiming job seekers allowance. We'll look at how it breaks down in a minute, but we can start by saying that it's true that since 2019, economic inactivity has increased dramatically from 8.6 million in January 2019 to almost 9.5 million in May 2024. So the right-wing press is blaming these lazy, work-shy people for the country's problems. Worklessness is threatening growth. Worklessness is causing the migration crisis. Worklessness is causing the riots. Taking the analysis in one of the Telegraph articles, for example, the work-shy have a lot to answer for. The economy is still being held back by worklessness as employers find themselves unable to tempt people into the jobs that desperately need to be done. Bosses are desperate to hire more staff, but as British-born adults drop out and stop seeking employment, companies and the public sector are forced to offer jobs to those born elsewhere instead. The poor employers. They're desperate to solve the country's economic problems, but the work-shy are letting them down. So employers have no choice but to employ migrants. I hope you can tell from my tone that I don't think that idle work-shy people are the cause of the UK's current economic problems. The facts just do not bear this out. So let's take a look at the facts. Firstly, the growth since 2019 only tells a partial story. This chart goes back to 1993 and it shows that there's been a massive fluctuation in the number of people economically inactive. Between 1993 and 2011, there were similar levels of increase as in recent years. So it's not evident that British people have suddenly become work-shy and that this is why inactivity has increased. It definitely requires further investigation. This chart shows the breakdown of economic inactivity into various categories. It can be seen that by far the biggest contributor to the growth of inactivity in these two periods is the number of students. Now, technically students are economically inactive, but of course they're fully occupied. They're not people that should be considered as part of the workforce. The second category that has seen significant growth is the long-term sick. I've done videos on this before about how the previous government was demonising sick people, suggesting that they weren't actually sick and should be forced back into work, that many of them were making a lifestyle choice. Interestingly, in the past few days, the Telegraph has published a couple of letters which give a different perspective on this, but a perspective that's not reflected in the Telegraph's own analysis. We have the CEO of the Royal Osteoporosis Society saying that every year tens of thousands of people in their 50s and 60s are forced out of their jobs and into serious hardship due to delayed diagnosis of musculoskeletal conditions like osteoporosis. They're not shirkers, they're neglected patients who would like nothing better than to carry on earning. The real problem is that half of NHS trusts are missing basic fracture liaison services to give people access to medication. It's not a coincidence that we have a record level of people on NHS waiting lists. The letter is focusing on one condition, but this is the truth of what's happening across the NHS. Another article on the same day pointed out that long COVID is a major cause of the increase in long-term sickness. In my household, both my adult daughters are now disabled due to its effects. One, a GP, lost her medical position because of the disease. To be merely labelling the sick as work-shy is not only inconsiderate and abusive, it's just plain wrong. The real problem is massive underfunding of the NHS. But more funding would require more taxes. So it's better to blame the sick than actually identify what the real problem is. So the increase in economic inactivity that the press has been commenting on is primarily caused by students and long-term sick, neither of which should be labelled as work-shy or idle. There is one more category where there has been some growth over the more recent period, and this is the other category. It's possible that some of these people may have just decided not to work. Especially during COVID, there was a feeling that people became more aware of what's important in life. Maybe some people decided that there's more to life than work. Maybe some people got sick of 0 hours contracts and poor working conditions. In my opinion, even these people don't deserve to be labelled idle or work shy. If they're not seeking jobs, of course, they wouldn't be entitled to job seekers allowance. So they're not asking the state to subsidise them changing their priorities. The truth behind the narrative that work-shy individuals are to blame for the UK's economic woes is a convenient but highly misleading scapegoat promoted by right-wing commentators. This oversimplified accusation ignores the deeper structural issues at play and shifts the blame away from the real problems. The core of the issue actually lies in the capitalist demand for a constant, readily available labour force. The system depends on perpetual growth and profit, and this means that any deviation from the norm, such as people choosing not to participate in low-wage, insecure employment, is seen as a threat. Rather than addressing the real problems, like the massive underfunding of public services or the exploitation inherent in many jobs, the narrative of the work-shy serves to distract from these more fundamental issues. In truth, if more people decided to prioritise their well-being over relentless work, and if the economy were restructured to value factors beyond mere profit and growth, society could very well be much better off. The right-wing media's fixation on blaming the work-shy not only misrepresents the reality, but also stifles the necessary conversation about how we might build a more equitable and sustainable economic system. I hope you found this information useful. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.